Okay. Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar titled Powering UK Food and Beverage Manufacturing, the Case for Solar PV in a High-Price Energy Market. I'm Ian McLean from the Sustainable Food Factory Conference and Exhibition 2025, which takes place on the 11th of June at Derby Arena, and I'm delighted to be joined by James Pullen, General Manager at Noble Green Energy, and Michael Cropper, Director at L&C Utility. Together, James and Michael will share their thoughts on how solar PV can help UK food and beverage manufacturers tackle short-term and future energy challenges, while also stabilising costs, boosting sustainability, and strengthening brand reputation. You'll also hear about the operational benefits solar PV can bring to a manufacturing facility and get practical advice to help you make more informed energy decisions. So let's get going. Okay, Michael, I'd like to start with you first, if I may. How have energy prices changed in recent years, and what is the outlook for the future?
Well, Ian, the landscape in recent years has been turbulent, to say the least. Going back to 2020, we observed some substantial demand destruction related to the pandemic, where businesses were operating with very little confidence when it came to their long-term energy requirements. This caused the market to tumble, and when you factored in cheap wholesale prices combined with a lack of uncertainty in the outlook for many sectors, it's perhaps unsurprising that the progress of various energy projects began to slow down. We were then very suddenly thrown towards the other end of the spectrum. Demand recovery was well underway in 2021, and we've begun to see the more typical fundamental drivers shaping the market. Carbon prices rebounded, we experienced record low wind generation, which put the market on a bullish track, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. That conflict began to wreak havoc on supply chains, particularly those of the UK and Western Europe, countries who are heavily reliant on receiving gas from overseas. In addition to various trade sanctions, we saw the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, damage and the indefinite closure of Nord Stream 1, and the future of other gas transit deals come under threat. Since then, further conflicts such as that between Israel, Hamas and Iran have kept geopolitical tensions high, and I would say that volatility is now very much the norm. Daily price movement that might have caused you to fall out of your seats in shock several years ago is now commonplace. Though we're no longer at the height of the energy crisis, the wholesale market does remain elevated. If we compare the current market to the pre-pandemic levels, we're seeing prices between 170 and 300% higher than they were this time 5 years ago. Without a clear solution on the horizon for the geopolitical turmoil, the support level for energy and fuel prices is likely to remain high for the foreseeable future.
So, have the recent price increases and the uncertainty made solar PV a more attractive option for manufacturers?
Yeah, I think one of the greatest benefits to solar in the current market is the stability that it offers. If you can generate on site and reduce your exposure to the market, you're not only having to avoid purchasing more expensive electricity, but you're also limiting your vulnerability to price shocks, whether that's during or between contracts. If you were someone who considered solar PV in the late 2010s or early 2020s and you found the return on investment didn't stack up, the chances are the landscape has changed significantly since then, and the benefits available have only increased.
And James, beyond energy price fluctuations and the sustained high energy costs, of course, what other factors have contributed to faster payback on solar PV?
Yeah, it's related exactly to what Michael's been saying. So the energy price rebound, if you like, when the economy started to recover from COVID, meant that the energy price shot up very high. So lots of the solar PV manufacturers decided they were going to ramp up manufacturing, knowing that the demand was going to increase because paybacks were better. New entrants came into the market. Before long, there was a glut of solar photovoltaic modules, especially around Europe. So that led to a decrease in pricing. There have also been, of course, increases in efficiencies within the modules themselves. So those two factors combined have led to the price per watt installed dropping from, say, circa 30 pence a watt a couple of years ago to around about 11 pence a watt now.
Do you see the efficiency improvements continuing, and if so, how will they affect future installation costs?
Yeah, absolutely. The module efficiency is going to continue to improve and improve as we sort of learn more, invest more. A typical sort of increase in manufacturing production of any product really leads to increased efficiencies. So we're going to see that continuing. We have reached, I would suggest, a plateau at the moment of prices where any sort of increases in efficiency leading to reductions in pence per watt are going to be minimal over the next few years until we see the next big leap in a big advance in technology.
And for food and beverage manufacturers in particular, outside of energy prices and or the increase in energy prices and the efficiency installation costs, what other factors should they consider if they're going to think about implementing solar PV?
Well, there's many factors outside of the payback, of course. The sustainability targets that they'll have, their own CSI, ESG agendas. There's pressure from stakeholders throughout the supply chain. Customers are more and more demanding green credentials. Supply partners are likewise. So there's many influences that are going to lead to F&B companies looking to implement renewable tech in the very near future.
And Michael, I suppose it's not just the cost of the PV array itself and the wholesale energy price which affects payback. There are obviously non-commodity costs that food and beverage manufacturers should consider as well, I'd imagine.
Indeed, the non-commodity aspect is one that's often forgotten, but in some cases the value is even greater than the cost of energy itself. I would expect for most commercial users, at least 50% of their electricity spend is made up of these non-commodity elements, and that's network charges, that distribution, transmission, the cost of getting the power to your site, government levies, for example, feed-in tariff, contracts for difference, and other aspects such as balancing charges. If you aren't taking power off the grid, you're also able to avoid many of these charges as well, not just the wholesale cost of energy. But I would say that customers still need to do their due diligence when calculating their ROI. Some companies may or may not be receiving relief on some of these charges, and in either case, businesses should be aware that when they're consuming solar, it doesn't mean all of the invoice charges will disappear completely. You have certain aspects, mostly fixed and standing charges, that will be unaffected. They'll often be related to your meter and connection type, as well as the amount of capacity you have reserved on the network. So it's not always a given that the business's peak demand will change once solar PV is implemented as well. Those peaks will most commonly occur over winter when solar generation is lower. Therefore, despite reducing your overall grid usage, you may not be able to reduce things like your reserved capacity. And that means your fixed charges won't change and they'll begin to make up a larger proportion of your spend. A lot of demand-related charges are also transitioning more from a time of day based rate to fixed charges. So when you're establishing your payback, it's important not to just look at what you're currently paying, but also what you might be paying in the future as well.
And in terms of the future grid modernisation, what impact will or would that have on the end user?
Yeah, so that's a real key consideration. The UK grid set to undergo its biggest upgrade since the mid 20th century. In the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see some huge changes in the network, and billions is going to be spent on upgrading infrastructure to cope with the influx of new renewable generation and to transport excess capacity and generation around the country when and where it's required. The cost of that is likely going to be borne, unsurprisingly, by the taxpayer and end users, and that means certain non-commodity costs are bound to increase. So if you're still reliant on predominantly grid power, you're going to feel the brunt of that more than those with on-site generation capabilities.
And James, are there any constraints a distribution network operator might place on the food and beverage manufacturer?
Absolutely, it's related to what Michael said about the transformation in the grid. So essentially, you were set up to have a central power station, and it was just feeding off to lots of off-takers. Now with renewable energy, you're having sort of solar PV and wind, etc., dotted all around. So you've got thousands of off-takers, and where they're not utilising the energy, they're looking to either push all of the energy back to the grid or push the excess they're not using back to the grid. And the grid's got to try and balance this now, thousands of different power stations, essentially. And what that is leading to is difficulties for the DNO. They're imposing restrictions. So there might be restrictions on the amount of energy that a business can export to the grid, or it might simply be a limit on the amount of generation capacity they can install, full stop. So we're seeing typically up to around about 1,000 kilowatt peak of install is generally the borderline where you tends to be okay to install that, with massive caveats. However, above that level, you're looking now to sometimes 2032, 2035 before you're able to get that grid connection. So yeah, issues are alive.
And James, just to add into that, in terms of current contracts and energy strategies, what should manufacturers consider and what actions can they take?
Yes, they need to take a holistic approach to energy management. So rather than looking at energy contracts in isolation or solar PV in isolation, you really need to consider when you're going to be installing the solar, when it's going to go live, and how that's going to impact on your current energy contracts. There's all sorts of things hidden deep in the depths of energy contracts. Take or pay clauses are often fairly evident, and they tend to be around about a 20% above or below that you can move before you start facing punitive charges. So for a food and beverage manufacturer, typically you would be utilising all of the energy that solar's generating. So it'd be 100% self-consumption typically, and that would tend to offset somewhere between 15 to 30% of your energy on site, broadly speaking. So you're creeping then into the danger zone, if you like, where you could be penalised. So this is where Michael will be able to elaborate more, I'm sure, on the intricacies of the contracts.
Michael, I had a question about energy strategies, actually. I wanted to know if should solar PV be considered in isolation or part of a kind of a broader, more comprehensive energy strategy?
Yeah, I think like any initiative that a company might consider when it comes to energy, solar is something that should always be considered as part of the company's wider energy and sustainability strategy. Now, I've already touched on network charges, but to begin with, as James has mentioned, the first step should always be to be reviewing your existing contracts, see what they permit you to do and what the impact might be if you start consuming a large portion of your electricity via on-site solar PV. Now, if you have fixed price contracts, as James has already mentioned, they almost certainly contain volume tolerance clauses. These are charges where the suppliers are allowed to apply punitive charges to you potentially if you've used outside of your agreed tolerances. We also have issues with flexible contracts as well. Many large users are flexible purchasers, and for those companies, they need to understand the impact not only of the contract rate side of things. It varies slightly to fixed price contracts, but you have things like shape fees that can be affected. But also you need to consider how your changing grid offtake will affect your trading position and how you might react to any changes in your expected generation. And when it comes to the wider energy strategy, solar isn't always the only solution being considered. Users might be looking at other changes that will actually increase their electricity demand, such as EVs and heat pumps. And therefore, having on-site generation can be key in keeping those costs down, but it needs to be managed effectively. And to understand how all those aspects might impact one another is absolutely crucial.
And in terms of risks, which I'm sure there are some, James, what risks are associated with solar PV installation and how can a manufacturer mitigate against those?
Yeah, so there's some more obvious risks, I guess. So the solar modules themselves with the mounting kit on a roof is going to add around about 15 kilograms of weight per square meter. So, it's not an inconsiderable weight. Any sort of modern building should withstand that perfectly adequately. However, it's obviously essential that you get a full structural assessment. There may be parts of roofs, particularly on older F&B sites, where wear and tear has started to creep in, cut edge corrosion creeping in. So you want to make sure there's a full roof survey and any roof repairs are done prior to any install. There's also potential risks associated not just with panels or the inverters, the wiring themselves creating fire, but there's a risk there of, if there is a fire created by something else within those premises, that there's 900 volts of DC cable dangling around, and if the fire brigade turn up and they see that with no real cut off, they're just going to stand there and sort of refuse to enter. Not being an emergency service professional myself, of course, I don't want to speak for them, but yeah, so there's a big risk there. There's also a lesser risk around planning. So if you're looking to install on a rooftop, generally it will fall under permitted development rights with some small caveats. However, you still need to actually get consent from planning. It's not just a case of saying it's permitted development and getting on with it, because there's a risk of forced removal occurring down the line. If you're looking at a ground mount or a solar carport, then you will need to have full planning approval, and that can take some time, because you have to look at arboricultural surveys, horticultural surveys. If someone saw a great crested newt a mile down the road 20 years ago, then that can delay things. It's lots of intricacies, but you can minimize all of this by just engaging with a solar professional who will offer you an end-to-end service. So they'll appoint structural surveyors for you, they'll liaise with the planning consultants, and they'll make sure that the equipment they're installing removes these fire-related risks.
Are there any specific insurance requirements that food and beverage manufacturers should be aware of?
Yeah, there are. So the insurance companies now are becoming more and more stringent and more knowledgeable around the installs of solar systems. So there's RC62, which is an insurance regulation document that's come out advising that on solar PV installs, they should all have something called arc fault detection and prevention. So this basically not only detects when an arc fault could occur and says it's occurring, you've got a problem. It detects that it's about to occur and shuts things down before it creates a fire. So when you're looking at installing solar PV, definitely get in touch with your insurers and let them know what sort of system you're planning to install, and they will advise whether they're happy or not. So all the systems that we install, for example, have gone through all of the comply with every single insurer's regulations. And it's very important. If you've got a 250 million pound, 500 million pound manufacturing site, you don't want that additional risk that A, that site's going to go down, or B, even production's going to go down for even a short amount of time, because you just completely offset the benefits from the solar PV. So don't want to run unnecessary scaremongering. Solar PV is great, done in the right way. It is the future of clean tech for the UK, but let's do it properly.
And James, beyond those directly involved in the actual solar PV strategy, how crucial is it to secure buy-in across the wider business, and how can this engagement contribute to the overall success of the business?
Yeah, so it's critical getting engagement all the way down the line. Just from an install point of view, for example, when you're installing solar PV, a large system on an F&B site where there's operations going on, you need to ensure that you're liaising with site managers, with the ops managers on sites, with health and safety, to make sure that you're not negatively impacting operations whilst the install's going on. You also need to make sure that the different areas of the business are bought into why you're doing this. So the finance department will want to see returns, of course. You'll have a sustainability director that wants to be able to report on the CSR, ESG credentials. So you'll have the chief exec, obviously, who wants to look at everything. You've got your supply chain looking at you, or the stakeholders looking at you, shareholders looking at you. What are you doing to make us more attractive as a business, both to work with and to work for? So it's very important to get all of those areas of the business engaged and bought into what it is you're trying to achieve.
And Michael, any further thoughts?
Yeah, echoing James, really, I think it's absolutely critical. He mentioned that holistic approach to begin with and adopting this as part of a wider business and energy strategy. So securing the buy-in and getting communication across the wider business is absolutely critical to making sure that you've got a successful initiative there. I think I would say it's important to always remember with solar PV, the key goal is to lower costs and to achieve long-term security. And you find that once you've done that, some of those benefits of business perception that James mentioned as well, and other additional opportunities start to appear. So I mentioned one such as export. Although the available export volumes for F&B businesses might be limited, it's a more cost-effective use of that surplus than things like battery solutions. And as energy prices remain elevated, the ability to sell back to the grid with whether that's via export agreements, PPAs, direct wires to local businesses as well, even, that allows you to gain added value that's both monetary and ESG. So it's really, really important.
Well, thank you, James and Michael, for sharing your thoughts on business energy and sustainability opportunities that solar PV offers to UK food and beverage manufacturers. We'll be sending all attendees a recording of the webinar, along with James and Michael's contact details. And as I mentioned at the start, the Sustainable Food Factory Conference will take place on the 11th of June at Derby Arena. The event is free to attend for food and beverage manufacturers and processors, and you'll be able to meet both Noble Green Energy and L&C Utility there. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers and panelists in June, and the day will be packed with valuable content delivered by food and beverage manufacturers who will share their insights and expertise on the decarbonisation of plant and supply chain operations. We'd love to see you on the day. And in the meantime, it just leaves me to thank you for taking the time to listen to today's webinar. Thank you.